There is a trap that is designed for Indian diplomats every time they walk into a Western forum. The format is always the same. A Western journalist or a Western politician asks about Russia, about sanctions, about weapons, about which side India is on, and the expectation is that India will explain itself, justify itself, apologize for its choices, accept the moral framework being handed to it, and try to work within it. On June 11th, 2026 in Finland, the trap was set one more time. They had forgotten who they were setting it for. It was the Kultaranta Talks in Finland, Finland's annual foreign policy forum, hosted by the Finnish president himself. Finland is a NATO country. It shares a direct border with Russia. The room was full of European foreign ministers, global policy figures, and journalists trying to put India on the defensive. When the lecture started, it did not go the way the room expected. And by the time it was over, Finland's own foreign minister was defending India. The journalist who had come to hold India accountable had been handed a mirror, and Jaishankar had walked out without apologizing for a single thing. The real topics on the table were the Russia-Ukraine war, the Iran conflict and the Hormuz crisis, the future of multilateralism in a world fracturing along power lines, and the place of countries like India in a global order that was built by others and is now being renegotiated by everyone. India was represented by the man who has spent the last several years turning India's diplomatic voice from apologetic to authoritative. Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, former career diplomat, former foreign secretary, now external affairs minister, arrived in Helsinki carrying a position that India has held for years, but rarely stated in quite this way, in this type of room, in front of this type of audience. He was seated alongside Finland's foreign minister, Elina Valtonen, and the UAE's Minister of State, Lana Nusiba. The moderator was a senior European journalist with a reputation for asking the uncomfortable questions that European forums specialize in. The expectation in the room was clear. India would be pressed on Russia. India would be pressed on Iran. India would be asked to explain itself. The expectation turned out to be wrong. The question came the way these questions always come. The journalist told Jaishankar that India had adopted moral equivalence on Ukraine, that India was too sympathetic to Russia, that India had been too willing to buy Russian oil. He was expected to explain himself to the room. S.Jaishankar did not defend himself. He just said he had two observations. The first one was about oil. He said he buys oil based on cost and availability. At the time India turned to Russian oil, much of the oil available on the global market was Russian oil, because European countries had moved quickly to buy up Middle Eastern oil, which was India's traditional supply. European demand had crowded India out of its own supply channels. Circumstances pushed India toward Russian oil. That is the economic reality. It is not sentiment. It is not sympathy. It is arithmetic. That observation alone was enough to reframe the question. India had not chosen Russia. India had been left with Russia after Europe took India's traditional supply. But Jaishankar was not finished. He had a second observation. He said, "No European country has been attacked with Indian weapons." He paused. Then he said, "I wish I could say that for European weapons in India." Then he was asked to be more explicit. He said, "Europeans sell weapons that are used to attack India." Not now, for many, many years. India has never done anything to endanger Europe. We Indians have never done anything to endanger Europe. That was the second observation, and it changed the entire geometry of the conversation. Think about what just happened in that room. A representative of a Western country had come to lecture India about moral equivalence in Ukraine. India's minister had responded by pointing out that European countries have spent decades selling weapons to Pakistan, weapons that have been used against India. The weapons that have killed Indian soldiers, the weapons that have funded terrorism that has targeted Indian civilians, European weapons used against India for decades, without any forum like this one being convened to discuss European moral equivalence. The accusation of moral equivalence had met a mirror, and the mirror was not comfortable. The conversation moved to Russia's oil and the sanctions regime. And here Jaishankar delivered what may have been his most devastating line of the entire forum. He reminded the room of a sequence of events that was inconvenient but undeniable. In 2022, When Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States specifically asked India to buy Russian oil, not in a private conversation that could be denied. It was policy. The logic was that if India kept buying Russian oil, the global oil market would remain more stable, and Russian revenue would be partially capped by price dynamics. India was told explicitly to buy Russian oil. Then in 2024, the United States put tariffs on India, in part because India was buying Russian oil. Then in 2025, after energy prices began hurting the global economy and domestic American politics, the United States lifted its sanctions on Russian oil again. Jaishankar looked at the room and said exactly what everyone in that room already knew, but had not said out loud. He said, "Let's not pretend there is some great principle involved here. We are all adults in the room. We know what the game is. Making this about sanctimony is really not warranted." The room went quiet, not because what he said was rude, because what he said was true. The sanctions on Russian oil were never pure principle. They were policy tools, switched on and switched off in response to American domestic politics and global energy prices. India had been asked to help stabilize the market. India had done so. India had then been penalized for doing so. And then the country that penalized India had reversed course for its own reasons without a word of acknowledgement. That is the game. And Jaishankar said so in public, in front of European foreign ministers, in a room that had come to lecture India about its choices. What happened next was not something anyone in that room had scripted. Finland's own foreign minister, Elina Valtonen, spoke. And instead of piling on with more criticism of India, she defended it. She reminded the room of something important that had been glossed over in the rush to criticize. When Europe and the United States introduced the oil price cap on Russian oil, the stated intention was not to prohibit the world from buying Russian oil. The intention was to ensure that Russia could not make excessive profit from its oil exports, that the revenue flowing to Moscow from energy sales would be capped at a level below market price. The entire system was designed to allow countries like India to continue buying Russian oil, just at a price that squeezed Russia's margins. That was the point. That was what the West agreed to. India had been operating within that system. India had been buying Russian oil within the price cap. India had been doing, more or less, what the West's own sanctions framework intended countries in India's position to do. A NATO foreign minister, the foreign minister of a country that had literally just joined NATO because Russia was its neighbor and its threat, had just defended India's position to a room full of Europeans. That is not nothing. That is significant. It means that even within the European foreign policy establishment, the narrative that India had done something wrong was not universally accepted. The honest reading of what India had done, by the honest reading of the rules that were put in place, showed India had not violated any principle. It had been caught in the politics of selective enforcement, praised when the enforcement suited American domestic needs, condemned when the politics changed. The conversation moved to the Iran war. The U.S.-Israel strikes on Iran that had begun in February 2026, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the global energy crisis that followed, and where India stood in all of it. The question was a familiar one. India had not condemned Iran. India had not joined the Western coalition. India was once again not choosing a side. Why? Jaishankar explained the geometry that Western commentators consistently fail to account for when they analyze India's position on any conflict. He said, there are four parties involved: the United States, Israel, Iran, the Gulf states. India has extremely strong relations with all of them. That is not a dodge. It is a description of reality. 10 million Indians live in the Gulf, not 1,000, not 100,000, 10 million. The Gulf countries are India's primary energy suppliers. Several of them are among India's top 10 trading partners. The UAE alone has a community of millions of Indians, a bilateral trade relationship worth over $100 billion, and a security partnership that has deepened significantly in recent years. India and the UAE negotiated their free trade agreement in 88 days and have already exceeded their $100 billion trade target. They are now aiming for $200 billion by 2032. Iran is India's neighbor across the Arabian Sea. India has had a continuous relationship with Iran across thousands of years of shared civilizational history. India currently has oil purchases from Iran, infrastructure investments in the Chabahar port on Iran's coast that gives India direct access to Afghanistan and Central Asia without going through Pakistan, and a diplomatic channel that almost no other country on earth maintains simultaneously with Iran, Israel, the Gulf, and the United States. What the West wants India to do when it says India should choose a side is to throw away three of those four relationships in service of one. That is not a serious ask. No responsible government would do it. No country that genuinely understands India's strategic position would expect it. Jaishankar made the point directly. He said, most countries are committed to wars they fight and equivocal about ones they observe. I can think of many wars close to us where the rest of the world is quite equivocal. He was right. The same European countries asking India to take a strong position on Iran had minimal engagement with the conflicts in India's neighborhood. With Pakistan-sponsored terrorism, with Chinese border aggression, with the crisis in Myanmar, for decades. Every conflict is the world's problem when it is in Europe. Every other conflict is someone else's regional issue. India has 10 million citizens in the Gulf, energy routes passing through Hormuz, four relationships to maintain, a country of 1.4 billion people to keep economically stable. The position India has taken is not moral weakness. It is strategic competence. Here is something that happened almost without anyone noticing in the middle of the Iran war, while the world was focused on whether Hormuz would reopen. Before February 28, 2026, the day the U.S.-Israel strikes on Iran began, India's largest gas supplier was Qatar. That was the established flow, the established relationship, the established commercial arrangement. By early March 2026, India's largest gas supplier was the United States. That shift happened in days, not in a planned diversification strategy announced years in advance. In days, in response to the new reality on the ground. Jaishankar used this example to make a point about resilience that the West rarely gives India credit for. He said, what is happening as the world is de-risking from the region? Countries are looking for alternative energy sources and saying, I am prepared to buy at a longer distance, maybe at a higher cost, but there is greater security and predictability in it. India is not a frustrated observer of this crisis. India is adapting to it faster than almost any country its size. The energy flows that defined the world on February 27th are significantly different and possibly irreversibly different from what they were before. India saw that coming. India moved. At the same time, Jaishankar was careful to say something that gets lost in the headlines. India's relationship with the Gulf is not only about oil, it is about 10 million people. It is about trade. It is about skills and talent in business and security. The oil and gas numbers are the ones that make headlines. The human relationships are the ones that make civilizations. In various interactions during and around the Finland visit, Jaishankar returned to a position on Pakistan-occupied Kashmir that India has held since 1947 and has recently begun stating with a clarity that leaves no room for diplomatic hedging. Pakistan-occupied Kashmir is Indian territory. It is under illegal occupation. It will return to India. That is not a political position. That is a parliamentary resolution backed by every political party that exists in the Indian parliament. The ruling party and the opposition, the left and the right, every shade of Indian politics united in a single commitment. He said, every political party of this country is committed to ensure that POK, which is a part of India, returns to India. This is our national commitment. He did not say this as a threat. He did not say it as a campaign speech. He said it as a statement of settled national consensus, in the same way that a French minister would state that Alsace is French, in the same way that any minister of any country states something that is constitutionally resolved and nationally agreed. The significance of saying this in a European forum, in the middle of a conversation about geopolitics and sovereignty in the rules-based international order, is worth pausing on. India's position on POK is not different in principle from Ukraine's position on Crimea. Both involve territory that was seized by force. Both involve a population living under occupation. Both involve a country asserting that the occupation is illegal and that the territory will one day be returned. When India says it, the West asks India to be measured. When Ukraine says it, the West calls it heroic resistance. Jaishankar does not say this. He does not need to. The comparison is visible to everyone paying attention. India also took steps. The abrogation of Article 370 that gave Jammu and Kashmir its special status was done in 2019. Elections have been held. Economic development has accelerated. The final chapter is POK, and on that chapter, there is no ambiguity about where India stands. The moderator asked about Donald Trump, about whether the second term had surprised Jaishankar. His answer was one of the most diplomatically honest things said in that room. He said much of what happened was actually declared in advance. Tariffs, for example. The world accustomed to its habits did not actually think this would be carried out. The assumption was that the rhetoric would not become policy or that policy would not become practice. That assumption was wrong. And it was wrong because the world was not paying attention to what was being said. Trump said he would impose tariffs. He imposed tariffs. Trump said he would take a transactional approach to alliances. He took a transactional approach to alliances. Trump said America first. He meant it. The shock was not in what Trump did. The shock was in the world discovering that it had not believed him. Jaishankar was careful and precise. He said he thought almost no one had expected the second term to be as radical as it turned out to be. But he also said something important about India's specific position. He said, in India's case, we are not an alliance partner. So it did not impact our security the way it would do to a NATO country or a bilateral treaty partner. India has no mutual defense treaty with the United States. India is not in NATO. India does not have a tripwire commitment that meant Trump's statements about NATO readjustment hit India the way they hit Germany or Poland or the Baltic states. India experienced the turbulence differently. India was affected by the tariff decisions. India was affected by the oil sanctions switching on and off. But India was not existentially shaken the way countries that had built their entire security architecture on American guarantees were shaken. That independence, the same independence that Western critics have called India's hedging or its refusal to commit, is the very thing that allowed India to navigate the most turbulent American presidency in modern history, with its partnerships intact, its economy functioning, and its strategic autonomy uncompromised. The adults in the room had known the game. India had played it. What happened in Finland was not a performance. It was not a diplomatic trick. It was not India finding clever words to avoid a difficult question. It was something much more fundamental. It was India changing the terms of the conversation. For the better part of 60 years after independence, India's default posture in rooms like the one in Helsinki was defensive. The instinct was to explain, to justify, to accommodate the framework being applied to India even when that framework was selective, inconsistent, or built on premises that did not apply to India's situation. The instinct came from a real place, a country that was poor, that depended on Western aid and Western markets, that needed Western approval to function in the global economy. The instinct made sense for that India. But India in 2026 is not that India. India is growing at 7.7% while the countries lecturing it are growing at 1 or 2. India is attracting close to $100 billion of foreign investment every year. India has nuclear weapons. India has a navy that patrols the Indian Ocean. India has a space program that put a lander on the moon's south pole before anyone else did. India has a pharmaceutical industry that supplies 40% of the world's generic medicines. India has a digital infrastructure, the Unified Payments Interface, the Aadhaar identity system, the DigiLocker, that is more advanced and more inclusive than the equivalent systems in most Western countries. This is not the India that needs to explain itself. This is the India that Jaishankar represents. And the thing that makes him extraordinary, the thing that has made his clips go viral across the world, the thing that has made him the most watched foreign minister on the planet, is not that he is aggressive. It is that he is completely, absolutely, unshakably calm. He does not shout. He does not lose his temper. He does not attack. He states. He clarifies. He presents the arithmetic. He asks the question that nobody had thought to ask. And when the room tries to push back, he has already anticipated the pushback and already has the answer waiting. That calm is not accidental. It is the product of 38 years in the Indian Foreign Service. It is the product of having served as ambassador to the Czech Republic, to Singapore, to China, to the United States. It is the product of having negotiated the India-US nuclear deal under a government of a different party and served as foreign secretary under a government of another party. He has been in the rooms where these decisions are made for 4 decades. He knows how the machinery works. He knows what pressure looks like from the inside, and he is completely unbothered by it. When he says to a room full of European ministers, "We are all adults here. We know what the game is," he is not being rude. He is being accurate. And the accuracy delivered that calmly is what makes it so devastating. There is no anger to dismiss as emotion. There is no nationalistic chest thumping to write off as politics. Just the facts, just the numbers, just the question that nobody had previously thought to ask out loud. After the Kultaranta Talks, the clips spread. As they always do when Jaishankar speaks, his line about European weapons attacking India became a headline. His line about being adults in the room who know what the game is became the kind of quote that gets shared in foreign policy circles as a summary of what the new India sounds like. But the bigger story, the one that does not fit neatly into a clip, is Finland. Finland's foreign minister did not have to defend India. She was under no obligation to push back against the framing of India as a sanctions violator. She could have let the criticism land, moved on to the next question, and let the room's existing view of India go unchallenged. She did not. She said India had operated within the rules. She said the price cap was designed to allow exactly what India had done. She said the criticism was based on a misunderstanding of what the West's own system was intended to do. That matters, not because India needed the defense. Jaishankar had already dismantled the accusation before she spoke. It matters because it shows that even within the European foreign policy establishment, the narrative about India is changing. The assumption that India is a problem to be managed rather than a partner to be engaged is not universal. There are people in European capitals who understand India's position, who see the logic of it, and who are willing to say so publicly even when the room is not expecting it. India has been working toward this for years. The diplomatic investments, the engagement with the European Union, the free trade agreement negotiations, the security and defense partnership, the talent mobility agreements, these are not just economic transactions. They are relationship building. They are the slow, unglamorous work of making India's position legible to people who have historically not paid attention to India's perspective. Jaishankar is not creating the India that speaks like this. He is expressing it. The country has the power now. The country has the economic weight. The country has the strategic position. He is the voice that translates that reality into language that the world can hear. There is something that happens in India when Jaishankar speaks at these forums. Something that goes beyond the policy analysis, something that goes beyond the diplomatic point scoring. Ordinary Indians feel it. For generations, Indians watch their leaders arrive at Western forums and become smaller. The apologetic tone, the careful language designed to avoid offense, the instinct to accommodate the framework even when the framework was not designed with India in mind. The assumption, visible to every Indian watching, that the person in the chair was representing a country that needed approval, that needed validation, that was grateful to be in the room. What Jaishankar does in rooms like Helsinki is not aggressive nationalism. It is something more interesting. It is the simple act of entering a room and behaving as though India belongs there, not as a guest who must justify its presence, but as a country with its own interests, its own logic, its own long history of navigating a complicated world that is entitled to state its position and be heard on its own terms. That is what Indians respond to, not the cleverness, not the sharp line, the posture, the refusal to be smaller than India actually is, the willingness to say in public in front of people who do not expect it, "We know what the game is, and we are not pretending otherwise." India has been in that game for a long time. For most of that time, the other players set the rules. The rules favored them. And India mostly played by their rules even when the rules were inconsistent, even when the enforcement was selective, even when the standard applied to India was not the standard applied to everyone else. That is changing. It has been changing for years. And in Helsinki, in front of Finland's foreign minister and the UAE's minister and a European journalist who came expecting a familiar dynamic, it changed again. The world is in transition. Jaishankar said it clearly in Helsinki. There is a tension in the world between parts of it that are stuck to where they were 80 years ago and parts that have moved. The global order was built after 1945. The institutions were built by the powers that won that war. The rules were written to reflect their interests. The moral frameworks were shaped by their assumptions. 80 years later, the world's population distribution is different. The world's economic weight is different. The countries that were colonies in 1945 are now some of the world's fastest growing economies. The countries that wrote the rules are struggling with their own internal politics, their own economic challenges, their own crises of legitimacy. India is not asking for that order to be destroyed. Jaishankar said clearly that multilateralism, however stressed, is still the best game in town. The UN needs reform, not abolition. The international system needs updating, not dismantling. India is not a revisionist power that wants to tear down what exists. It is a reformist power that wants what exists to reflect the world as it actually is, not the world as it was in 1945. But while India advocates for reform, India is not waiting. India is not sitting on the sidelines watching the old powers decide what the new order will look like. India is at every table. India is in every conversation. India is engaging with the EU and with Russia, with the US and with Iran, with Israel and with the Gulf, with the Quad and with BRICS, with the Global South and with the G7, not because India has no position, but because India's position is that no single bloc, no single relationship, no single alignment defines India's interests entirely. That is not hedging. That is strategy. It is the strategy of a civilization that has been navigating complex worlds for 5,000 years and has learned that the countries that tie themselves completely to one mast tend to sink when that mast falls. India is building. India is growing. India is asserting. And India is doing all of it on its own terms, in its own way, according to its own logic. In Helsinki, in a room that came to lecture India, India did not get lectured. India told the room what the game was. India reminded the room of the weapons. India asked the room to remember who had asked India to buy Russian oil in the first place. India explained why it has 4 sets of relationships in the Middle East and refuses to destroy 3 of them to satisfy one. And then India went back to doing what it has been doing for years: building, growing, talking to everyone, owing nobody an apology. The era of seeking validation from people who were never going to give it is over. The era of India writing its own story, on its own terms, in pursuit of its own interests. That era is here, and Jaishankar is holding the pen. Thank you for watching this through to the end. If you found this useful, share it. That is the best way to support this channel. Like, subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.